But I think really our group started out back in September 15th, 1964, when I came out of a 16-day blackout drunk and knew I was just about dead. And I was scared enough that I decided I would do what my doctor, my minister, and a psychiatrist at all suggested I do, and that is called Alcoholics Anonymous. I made that call, and in a matter of a very few minutes, a guy named Jim was here at my house. And one of the lessons this taught me was how important it is that we respond to a call for help as soon as we possibly can, because as soon as I made that call, I thought, what on earth have I done to call Alcoholics Anonymous? And I went back to the bedroom and had another drink, and Elaine came and said, here's this guy. We sat in this room, and he told me his story. And he took me down to the club, and they put me with a bunch of guys that seemed to be happy to have me there, because everyone that came in the club came over and shook my hand, gave me a hug, and told me how glad they were I was there. And I thought they were all crazy as hell until I'd been around a while and began to understand how important it is to see an alcoholic coming off a drunk. I kept going down there every day until I finally got myself sobered up and able to function again. And I hung around there for about 5.5 years, and we almost every day had an alcoholic that we were drying out. And it's so therapeutic to sit there and watch an alcoholic come off a drunk, to see the misery they go through, to watch them puke their guts out in a wastebasket, to see those bloodshot eyes, that flushed face, that perspiration, to see them crapping in their pants and doing the things that alcoholics do. And that kept me busy for about 5.5 years, and then I had a chance for a new profession that seemed very exciting, and so I got involved in that. At about 11 years after my last meeting, 16 years after my last drink, I'd been bird hunting over in East Texas all day and staying in a motel in Tyler. And Tyler is a bone-dry city. And I got back to the motel and sat down on the side of the bed, and a thought went through my mind, wouldn't a beer taste good? Hadn't had a drink in 16 years, but it seemed like a great idea. And since there was no beer in Tyler, I drove to Kilgore, 70-mile round trip for a 6-pack of beer and a package of beer nuts. I had 1.5 cans of beer, poured the rest of it out. And the thought went through my mind how I'd wasted 5.5 years hanging out with those damned alcoholics, because I was not an alcoholic, I just proved it. Well, 2 years later, I found myself back in AA, very, very drunk. And there was a tremendous change in what I saw in the same group that had found me earlier. There weren't any drunks laying around. It was what they called discussion meetings, where a lot of people were sitting around talking about various and sundry things. And I was so out of it, I wasn't aware of what was going on, but I looked for my old friends and I didn't see one of them. At the end of the meeting, though, something happened that really made a difference in my life, because 8 kids came up and gave me a hug and told me how glad they were I was back. And I got pretty serious about making meetings, but I just couldn't understand, where are the drunks? Where are the ones that make this thing so vivid in our mind? And it was over 5 months before I finally saw a drunk come to a meeting. And when I saw that guy come through the door, I went up and grabbed him, gave him a hug, set him down on the bench and said, buddy, I'm your sponsor, and I know I killed poor old Vern. But he made me aware of what it was I was missing, and that is the need to be around alcoholics coming off drunk. So I got real busy looking for places where I might go, and he was successful in finding some. While I was doing it, taking care of my business over in East Texas, old George B. was a taper here in Dallas at that time, and George and I had the same sponsor here in Dallas, old Paul. And George kept me supplied with tapes. And so I was making my rounds over in East Texas, taking care of business. I had a tape playing all the time, either an AA or an Al-Anon. And as a result of being able to hear these icons, I could come up with a bunch of buzz lines that I could pop in discussion meetings, and people would say, "Oh, I love what you said." And so I got to be real hip and slick and cool in those discussion meetings, but I was still miserable as hell. And one of the tapes that I heard was a guy named Joe that lived in Little Rock, Arkansas. And George didn't give me that one. Where it came from, I don't know, and I don't remember who I loaned it to, but you learn a lesson when you loan something to an alcoholic. It's a gift. You'll never get it back. So I don't know who's got it. But I listened to old Joe over and over and over. Elaine and I had found the old Jack place up on the White River up north of Mountain View, Arkansas, and we loved it up there. Ideal fishing, ideal hunting. And we'd go up there 3, 4, 5 times a year. And every time we went through Little Rock, I'd think, is there any chance I could find this guy Joe? And it just seemed like such a ridiculous idea to think about finding a guy named Joe in Little Rock. I had no idea if I'd have stopped and asked anybody if they knew old Joe McHugh. They'd said, "Oh, hell yes, he's down at 2500 South Broadway there in that big 3-story house." But we go on up the river, and I'd keep thinking about this guy. Well, back in the late 70s, my daughter had made up her mind that she was going to be a nurse when she was a little girl, and by the time she got into the 70s, she had graduated, become a registered nurse. And I don't know what got into her, but she bought one of those little 2-seat Porsches. And at that time, they were sort of a hot item, and they had that little Porsche clan that anytime you saw somebody driving along in a Porsche, well, you went beep, beep, and waved at them. Well, Carol was headed someplace, and she saw an old boy who had a flat tire, and she stopped to see if she could help him. He happened to have a Porsche, incidentally. And it wasn't long before they were going together, and then they got married, and old Jim was a native of Arkansas. He's working for a department store in Dallas. He had an opportunity to move back to Little Rock, working for a department store there, and so they moved back to Little Rock. And we went up for Christmas in 1983 and hadn't been back a year yet. And one of the first things I did was get in the telephone directory and find out where the groups were, and I picked out one that I kind of knew the address. I had some idea where it was. And I drove to this place and had for a noon meeting. And I remember the topic, and I remember basically most of that meeting. And it was on step 3, and what I was hearing up there was quite different than what I heard in our groups at home. And finally, the chairperson looked over my left shoulder and he said, "Joe, what do you think?" And I heard that voice. Now, I had a picture of Joe being a tall, lanky cowboy, kind of like old Bill Wilson. And I turned around because I recognized that voice, and here was a guy who was black, bald, and had a beautiful smile. After the meeting, I told him I'd been listening to this tape. Was there any chance that I might have some time with him? I couldn't believe it. The sad and simple truth of it is Joe hardly ever went to your discussion meetings. It just so happened they had taken over that old funeral home up there. Across from the Baptist Hospital, it had been abandoned and very dilapidated, and some of the members of AA had worked out a $1.99 lease with Baylor to use that place for AA meetings and Al-Anon and whatever. And Joe was one of those involved, and he was up there doing some work on the house. And it so happened he got caught, time got away from him, and it came noon, and so rather than be a snob, he went on into the meeting. How on earth I could have wound up in one of those groups at noon on that particular day in Little Rock and had Joe there for one of the very few times he ever showed up, I never know. But we went down to Serenity House, and we sat there and visited a while. And Joe very lovingly told me 2 things. One is I didn't have a clue what alcoholism was, and I damn sure didn't know anything about the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. And he really hurt my feelings because I was so slick in these meetings, and Joe says, "You don't know anything, so shut up." Not those words, because Joe never I never heard him make a negative comment to anybody about anything. But he sat there a little bit and he said, Cliff, when you drink, do you ever get enough? And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, we had lunch and you had a glass of buttermilk. When you drink buttermilk, do you ever get enough? And I said, well, of course I do. One glass is normally enough. He said, when you start drinking alcohol, do you ever get enough? I said, oh my God, no, I always drink way too much. He said, did you plan to when you started drinking? I said, no, I hadn't. He said, it sounds to me like you may have an allergy to alcohol. And he opened the big book to the doctor's opinion and read that paragraph. We believe, and so suggested a few years ago, that the action of alcohol in these chronic alcoholics is a manifestation of an allergy. That the phenomenon of craving is limited to this class and never occurs in the average temperate drinker. He said, it sounds to me like you've got that allergy. You are physically powerless over alcohol. I said, oh my God, I'm not powerless over people, places, and things. He said, if you are, you need to go to PPTA. AA is for alcoholics. And then he looked at me and he said, Cliff, have you ever made up your mind to never drink again? Oh, so many times, Joe. He said, if you could manage that decision, would you and I be talking? And all of a sudden, I understood step one for the very first time and knew I had it. He and Charlie came to Dallas a short time after that, and they did their Big Book Comes Alive weekend, and I went up and spent the weekend, every minute of it, listening to those two guys. And between the time I had with Joe originally and listening to them, I realized I didn't know anything about this outfit called Alcoholics Anonymous, the program. And we kept going back to Little Rock, and the more I went back there and went in to sit in their meetings up there, the more I began to recognize I've got to devote some time to learning what those folks do up there, what our founders did that makes it possible for us to live sober today. And so I got some of the kids I was working with, and we started having a Wednesday evening meeting here at home. It wasn't a group as such, it was just we had a big book study. And after a couple of years, we had 3 wind-up places we were going to every week, which is a requirement. If I'm going to work with somebody, they've got to have a place where they're going looking for those people who are dying of alcoholism. But after a couple of years, we had enough that we decided we'd form a group. Before we did, though, Joe and Charlie did a big book seminar up in Tulsa in November of 1987. And Joe said he wanted me to come up there. It was a 4-day deal, a complete package of Alcoholics Anonymous, the big book, the 12 and 12, the 12 traditions, and the 12 concept workshop. And I met a guy up there named Joe McCoy, and he's the one that has taken Joe's place with Charlie. Of course, they're both out of business now, but I met him, and Gene Lott, the guy that I'd met at Brownwood at Man to Man, is the man who had told me about this seminar, and we'd become very good friends, and he said, I'd like for you to come up there, and I thought, I don't want to go up to Tulsa, I know enough about the big book. But Joe and Charlie were up at the Sloan group in Denton, and I drove up Sunday morning to hear them, and Charlie announced my presence there when they were winding up on step 4. He said, we're going to talk about sex today, so you can bet your life Cliff will be here. I don't know how he knew, but anyway. Anyway, after the meeting, I was going to take him back to the airport, and I told Joe, Gene had mentioned something about this seminar. And Joe said, yeah, I think it'd be a great learning experience. I'd like for you to come. And he's my sponsor now, so away I go. But meeting Joe McCoy up there and Gene both had big groups. And I made up my mind I was going to go back up there and visit these guys because I honestly didn't think yardbirds like me could create a group like Joe had back in Little Rock. Well, I went up there during that great ice storm at the early January in 1988 and went for Joe's group, and then I went to Gene's group, and both of them were strictly big book. And I sat there, Gene had some calls to make, and I sat there in his dining area while he was making some sales calls, and looked out in the backyard on his patio, and he'd had a bird feeder out there, and the birds were feeding, and I sat at that table and I thought, you know what, dear God, I really need a group like this at home. If it's okay with you, can we have one? And I got home and told the kids that I thought it was time for us to start thinking about forming a group. One of the things we had to have was a place to meet. And one of the things that happened between the time I was at that seminar in November and the time we decided we'd do something for the group, one of the fellows I'd been involved with in scouting had passed away. And I felt obliged to go to his celebration of life. Elaine and I got real upset with the church back in the 60s and quit going. And while I was sitting there at his celebration, I didn't really recognize the preacher, but it occurred to me I had never made amends with that group of people. The horrible resentment I had for running my preacher on. And what I felt like was, why don't you shut up, preacher, and let me get up behind that pulpit and tell everybody how I've hated your guts for 20-some years, and I hope you can forgive me. Tell me what I can do. It seemed like that probably wasn't the appropriate thing to do under the circumstances. So I asked Joe, what are you doing? He said, well, it's simple. Get an appointment with the minister and tell him about your resentment and you want to get things squared away. I did. And one of the things that really blew me away was when I was telling him about my story and what we were doing in Alcoholics Anonymous. He said that we've got some members of the congregation that have a problem. He said, I don't know what to do with them. You may be an answer to that prayer. And he had tears in his eyes. And when we left, I felt like we had a pretty good relationship. Well, when I got back from Tulsa, I was hot to trot. And so I called Stan and asked him if I could have an appointment. He said, you bet, I'd like to see you. And I went up there and told him what I had in mind. He said, I've been intending to call you. He said the board of directors had a meeting here a couple of weeks ago and they decided they wanted to expand our outreach activity. And I was thinking maybe a group of Alcoholics Anonymous might be a good addition to that effort. And so the next week we had our founders meeting. Now, I had sent out letters to a lot of my old friends. I knew where they were and told them what we had in mind, that we were going to form a group that focused on the big book. We were not going to have any I, my, me. It was going to be learning what our founders did and could they possibly support. We had about 70 people lined up there. And we made most of the decisions that the group needed to make. One of them was the name of the group. And since we were going to go back to the big book, I wanted to call it the Renaissance Group. Well, one of the gals in there, a nurse, said, why don't we call it the Primary Purpose Group? Because that's what the fifth tradition says a group is supposed to do. So I was voted down. And God am I glad. With all the noise we have around the world with people who have patterned their group after what we are trying to do here, they're being attacked in many places for being something that is outside mainframe Alcoholics Anonymous, and tragically, but that is the way it is. But we went ahead and got our group going. And I wanted to have just one night a week meeting, Tuesday night, and somebody said we need to study the 12 and 12, so we started the Thursday night meeting. And we got started, I didn't let anybody know what we were doing. It was just our effort up there to form a group. I did register the group with General Service Office, but other than that, we didn't make an announcement of it. And we started out visiting those 3 places we had, and somehow or other people began to find out what we were doing. And we had quite a number of people who came in who attacked what we were doing. We were creating a problem with other groups, and I wondered how on earth we're not bothering any groups. But they didn't like what we were doing because we would not tolerate people telling us their ideas, opinions, and their experience and knowledge. We were there to study what did our founders do that really has worked for all these years. And the result of it was we had some of our members who just couldn't take the heat, so they went back wherever they came from or left altogether. But we finally got the core unit, and we just stayed very focused on what we were about. And we started getting people at the wind-up joints to, for the first time, hear what our program is, and so they started checking us out. Some liked what they heard and stayed, some didn't, they left. But we were just making slow progress in building the group up. One of the things that happened was, it helped a little bit, was that one night Dara and Don walked in and handed me a plastic bag. And Dara just said, "Do it." And I had no idea what they were talking about. And I looked in that bag, and there was a Microsoft front page for Windows program and a book, Microsoft Windows for front page for Windows for Dummies. And certainly I was that. But I accepted the challenge and went to work with it, and amazingly enough, we came up with a website that has been very, very popular and has helped a number of people decide they too want to get back into the basics of Alcoholics Anonymous. Wasn't long after that that on one Thursday night we were having what we called a sharing meeting. It wasn't a discussion meeting. It was Thursday night had been a transitional meeting for quite a number of years. It was from the 12 and 12 to listen to Joe and Charlie, and to taking the steps together to finally went back to a closed meeting of the 12 and 12. And before we started the big book on Thursday night again, a couple of guys showed up that one Thursday night, and they said, "Why don't you chair the meeting, Cliff?" And so I said, "I'll be happy to." And we just had a small group, maybe 12, 15 people show up that evening. And I said, "Why don't we talk about the promises and what's required for those promises to become a reality in our life?" And here's this guy, Mark, and a guy with looked like Santa Claus with a patch on his eye. We're sitting there, and kids were pretty tuned in on what it was we were talking about. They knew what the promises were. They knew what the requirements were. And Mark had a few comments to make, but that guy with the beard and the patch on his eye sat there and didn't say a single word. And so I sort of assumed he must be a newcomer, and Mark had brought him in to let him get acquainted with Alcoholics Anonymous. I didn't know that his twin brother was at a point of deciding either to drink or commit suicide, and so this guy, Chris, was checking out a group to send his brother to in hopes it might save his rear end. About 2 weeks later, this guy comes back, but this time the patch is gone. And I looked at him and I thought, you know what? I need to chair more meetings, but when you get that kind of power, why, you need to share it. Myers absolutely was an enigma when he showed up. He had 7 years of discussion meetings. And he was a challenge. And I kept encouraging him to try to get into the big book and keep coming up with some of this crappy stuff. And finally one night I did what I had did every once in a while back in the early days to keep people focused on why that group was formed. I wrote a little note and went by and passed it to him, put it right in front of him. And he'd been popping off Sunday stuff, and he says he thought I was going to tell him how great he was, and what the note says is, "Why the hell don't you shut up till you know what's in the big book?" And he started to leave. He just didn't like being squared away like that. And he started leaving. Old Philip stopped him at the door, and he said, "I know what you got. We've all had notes like that. Go back and sit down." He did, and became a member of our group. The website has been one way of expanding the message around the world. It's been such an amazing thing. The members have been invited to a number of conferences worldwide. They too have been a messenger of what this thing is really about. the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. As the, the group grew, we started having a little bit more difficulty in keeping the focus on the meetings. We'd had quite a number of people come from other groups who believed really were indoctrinated in discussion meetings, and there's nothing wrong with that, except it just wasn't appropriate in our group. And it became more difficult to keep our focus. The chairperson had to more redirect their thinking. And so somebody said, well, why don't we have a study guide? Well, we'd been using Joe's. Joe had one that was very effective, but it stopped at chapter 7. And what happened as soon as we started into 8, 9, 10, 11, we were back fighting the don't drink and go to meeting folks again. So it sat down and we put together the study guide that we now use. The problem we had, of course, is it's not hard to prepare the thing, but how are you going to get it published? And one of the godsends is that Myers showed up in our group, and Myers is in the bookbinding business, so the problem of how to have it produced was solved. It too has been a source of motivation for people to decide they're going to get back into the program and quit relying so much on meetings and the fellowships. And meetings in the fellowship are fine, but for many of us, they're just not enough. And what we found is that by using this and the other the encouragements that we've been able to afford to other people around the world, the message has been spread and spread and spread. The group that didn't have a prayer of surviving, I was told that by a couple of the old timers at our foundation meeting. After the meeting, they said, Cliff, if all you're going to do is study the big book, you haven't got a prayer. And I keep repeating myself and saying I'd like to dig those two old suckers up and show them what's going on in this world of ours today called the Primary Purpose Group in Dallas. Never dreamed that we'd be seeing a couple hundred people sitting huddled over their study guide and over their big book learning what the program is. And the many people in our group are very anxious to get out and search for people who are experiencing alcoholism. They have no idea what their problem is. They have no idea there's a solution for it. And yet as our kids with their enthusiasm get out there and present the big book to them and reflect their attitude toward life, it's been a real magnet to quite a number of people, and there's been a source of our growth. To me, it's one of the greatest miracles that I have experienced in Alcoholics Anonymous. And go back to 1964, the miracle that happened there. But from there to where we are today has been a series of things that have happened that, well, we call them coincidences. But my daughter gave me a little plaque after I got back that I have on my lamp in the office. It reads, a coincidence is when God does a miracle and remains anonymous. And our group certainly has been one that has had a series of miracles that makes it possible for us to be what we are today. And I pray to God we will never slow down, that this group will continue to function and serve others as long as God chooses to use us. I don't think very many people who even study the big book are aware of the number of times that Bill says we approach him, we approach him, we approach him. We don't sit and wait for him, we approach him. And back in chapter 7, he says, go search for them. Well, this is what our members do. And it's been so amazing to see how many places have learned what our kids do, bringing the message of the big book to the residents of their wind-up joints. And have been impressed with the results, and they call members of our group and say, will you please come and carry that message to members of our facility? It's gotten to be a number that's almost unreal. But the number of places that have asked members of our group, please come in here and bring this message, to me is absolutely astounding. As of today, I think we're somewhere around 50 different places that our members go to every week taking the message of the big book. That's what I envision as our goal for the rest of however long God wants us to be around and help alcoholics survive alcoholism. until genetic engineering comes up with that magic pill. Let's keep this group going.